It is the 41st millennium.
Hello folks, yet again I've put together this full guide covering absolutely everything there could possibly be to know about the heavy class in PvP. All available equipment and how it can best be used, playstyles, how we can get better and the limitations of this class, and all matchups between the Bulwark and the other classes. As always, this guide is absolutely rammed with information, so let's not waste any time. As a brief FYI, I do now have a collection of guides out currently. The next two guides will be Tactical and then Assault. Expect both of them and other guides within the coming weeks. And I also just wanted to say I'm interested in doing a top 10 weekly play series. The plan is to collect 2 or 3 episodes worth of footage over the next couple of weeks and then begin releasing 1 episode a week as I continue to receive more clips. If anyone is interested in taking part in this series, then all of the info is in the description below. Otherwise, let's get started. The Heavy at its core is primarily a DPS class with tank-like qualities that is to support the team by not only securing and holding ground, but repelling enemy teams with deadly force. Securing kills is our primary objective. It should come as no surprise that the Heavy offers the highest range damage potential of all classes, rivaled only by the likes of Tactical. Both classes have massive damage at range with high fire rates, but the Heavy is able to keep up that barrage of damage for much longer, at the cost of mobility and the distinct disadvantage in melee scenarios. Of all classes, the Heavy relies the most on solid team presence and support. We have the most disadvantaged matchups against other classes, the worst melee options, and Bulwarks are so strong against us that if we don't keep them at range, then it's practically a free kill for them. That said, we do have options, and the Heavy can certainly hold its own in many different situations. It all mostly comes down to having team presence, understanding our position within a team's dynamic, and knowing how to deal with each possible enemy matchup. For instance, the Heavy is great at taking aggro from multiple enemies, allowing the Heavy's teammates to set up flanks and take advantage of such aggro. The Heavy offers a very effective range playstyle that rewards those who adapt to difficult variables inherent to the class's strengths and weaknesses. For equipment, we will be covering primary weapons, sidearms, melee combat, grenades, and lastly the Iron Halo. Just before we get into our primary options, I wanted to point out a distinct difference between the Heavy and every other class. When using ADS with our primary weapon, we significantly decrease our movement speed, more so than any other class. We can choose to fire our weapon in third-person mode instead. For a Heavy bolter, this results in being far less accurate and having a significantly slower fire rate, but we are able to move quicker than using ADS. For the Heavy Plasma Incinerator and the Melta, we do have a slower fire rate than that of ADS, but we also have the increased movement speed. It's important to consider this when engaging with any enemy, as for instance, whilst using the Heavy Plasma, we may lose 1v1s we would otherwise win if we had have shot from ADS due to the high fire rate. This is the only offset to the Heavy's movement, outside of the fact that our dodge button will immediately do a dodge roll, as with some other classes it is initially a sidestep followed by a dodge roll if the dodge button is pressed again. Bear this in mind when considering every fight. If we don't already have good positioning and need to move into it first, we will likely take gunfire long before we've had chance to shoot back. This highlights exactly why we mostly want to have our position somewhat secure before engaging in most fights. This is a general rule and there will be occasions where this isn't applicable, but ultimately we generally peek corners and react slightly slower than other classes. As a final note, it's essential that we understand the Heavy is great at aggro. They are a prime target for many classes and are able to defend themselves quite well for brief periods of time. This will present prime opportunities for other classes such as the Assault, Vanguard or Sniper to flank the enemy team as they are engaging and closing down on the Heavy. This is a specific example of the team providing relief to the Heavy in an offensive manner and just one of many scenarios where it all hinges on the effectiveness and ability of the team to support. Beginning with our 3 primary options, they all offer a distinctly different playstyle from one another. I'm going to get the Melta out of the way immediately. I wouldn't usually criticize a weapon like this, but the Melta is truly in need of a rework if it's ever going to be effective within PvP. I've tried to play this weapon to its strengths, but I'm quite convinced that it just currently has none. Our close to mid-range damage is severely lacking, our long-range damage is naturally non-existent. I found myself beaten in pretty much every 1v1 scenario without the use of Iron Halo. I struggled to secure kills due to a sheer lack of damage, and despite all of my best efforts, I could just not pull off any effective plays with this weapon. I honestly don't have much advice outside of don't use it until it's been fixed. It's very easily outmatched and our alternative primary options are significantly better. The Heavy Bolter will be everyone's go-to until the Heavy Plasma Incinerator has been unlocked. This weapon is basically a minigun that thrives at close to medium range due to its incredibly high fire rate and deceiving accuracy. We fall off considerably at long range, but not entirely. It's very inaccurate, but given our fire rate, the damage is somewhat consistent at long range. This weapon lacks a reload entirely and relies on an overheat mechanic being maintained in order to not overheat. We can fire without cooling down for as long as roughly 8 seconds, and the cooldown for overheating is roughly 5 seconds. Naturally, we stop heating up with this weapon and begin cooling slowing it down by simply just not shooting. A solid strat is the dodge roll between gunfire, as whilst rolling our gun will cool down slightly. The last thing we want to do is to remain a stationary target whilst doing so. In a straight up 1v1 firefight at close to medium range, we should be winning almost every time. We have 4 armor slots over every other class having 2, outside of the tactical having 3 and the Bulwark having 4. Despite the tactical having 3 armor, we can and will consistently beat them in straight 1v1s also. It will come down to how soon we can pull our trigger, and there is a slight wind up to using this gun, but once it is shooting, it does have incredible damage. It will also come down to Iron Halo usage, which is something we will cover to a much deeper extent later on, but the general rules are: don't initiate with your Halo, use it mid-fight once your armor has already soaked up whatever damage it can. Using Iron Halo like this will effectively waste a lot of the enemy's magazine, and due to our complete lack of needing to reload, we can keep firing right through enemy reloads. This gun is very oppressive and can be used to keep enemies inside of their cover. This is situational in terms of usage, but can be used to buy time, cover allies, or generally zone enemies out. Lastly, I wanted to mention this gun's ability to deter melee attackers. Due to the heavy having very poor melee, I found a somewhat reliable strategy is to unload whatever you can into any enemies that commit to meleeing you. This is almost always better than engaging in the melee yourself. Unless the enemy is clearly 1 or 2 hits from death, then using your primary is almost always a better option. Overall, it's an excellent weapon when used correctly with the rest of the heavy's equipment, and is very reliable in a lot of situations. As for the heavy plasma incinerator, I feel like this weapon slightly beats out the heavy bolter in terms of effectiveness, but only slightly, and it doesn't make the heavy bolter a bad weapon by any means. I just feel the heavy plasma incinerator is more technical and offers more versatility in fights. There's a fair bit to cover with this weapon. Firstly, it recently received a buff in the 3.0 update. Its ammo increased from 55 to 60, its splash damage increased by an undisclosed amount, its overheating was changed from 50 to 30 for charged shots and 20 to 15 for standard, and lastly, it received a 10% damage increase across the board. This gun is essentially a plasma grenade launcher where our projectiles explode on impact, and with that essential firing mechanic comes a whole range of utility. We can charge our shots for bigger blasts and more damage. We can angle our shots to damage enemies behind or peeking cover. We can land shots on surfaces next to enemies, and we can use this weapon to somewhat consistently negate a Bulwark shield. Somewhat. One thing I'll point out immediately is this weapon does deal damage to ourselves if used at extremely close range, sometimes resulting in our death but not the death of our opponents. This essentially adds to the fact that we primarily need to keep our targets at range and control our fights best we can. The other drawback to this weapon is a complete inability to land accurate shots on assaults who have taken to the skies. It's not impossible, but it's also not very practical. We do have a sidearm for these scenarios, but this is something I'll cover more when discussing that. I enjoyed using this weapon the most as it mainly opens scenarios up for multiple angles of engagement, as opposed to just setting up on sight lines and holding down the trigger. With good enemy knowledge and positioning, we can assist team fights, flank enemies, and still hold effective positions all at the same time. We suffer no drop off in damage at any range, just longer travel times for our projectiles, respective to the distance of the shot. A small side note is always consider we can fire and then move, allowing our projectiles to still travel and land. The only difference moving makes is not being able to secure an additional shot. Always consider this when trading. It's situational, but a slight advantage to the firing mechanics of this weapon. We also naturally suffer from a significant projectile drop. There's not much to say here other than using this weapon will give you a feel for this with time, and after a little while it's not much of an issue. This does make leading our shots somewhat important when firing on moving targets, and it also means we need to take enemy terrain into consideration. Some shots will be easier to land than others. Speaking of moving targets, this weapon thrives against packs of enemies holding a line. It can do well in 1v1s and smaller engagements, but primarily will have the most effectiveness when being fired into packs of enemies otherwise engaged with your team already. As for single moving enemies, landing any shot to the floors or walls close enough to an enemy will still secure heavy damage, and we don't need to necessarily always land direct shots. Charged shots genuinely feel powerful and less of a gimmick than that of the plasma sidearm. A solid charged shot in the right spot can easily secure a kill or immediately force an enemy to reconsider taking the fight. Taking all of this into consideration, I would often aim my shots at the terrain where the enemy is either heading towards or taking cover next to, and I was pleasantly surprised with its effectiveness. Overall, the heavy plasma incinerator is currently a very strong weapon both inside and outside of team fights. It offers a distinct and fun playstyle and is my personal favourite for the heavy class. We have the same 2 choices for sidearm as the Bulwark class. If you've seen my Bulwark guide, then you'll know how this goes already. For those who haven't, it goes like this. There isn't much difference between both the bolt pistol and the plasma pistol sidearms. It's mostly preference. Regardless of choice, they are reliable weapons that are not to be underestimated. Enemies simply cannot ignore sidearm damage. That said, as a heavy, it's situational how often we will be using this. Starting with the bolt pistol, the advantages are higher ammo reserves and magazines. It also feels easier to land shots with the bolt pistol due to the bullet travel time being quicker than that of the plasma. It's also slightly more reliable for shooting enemies out of the sky. Due to ammo, the bolt pistol will last longer in a fight, and thus we will need less ammo pickups. Overall, outside of reloading, it's less management for pretty much the same results. The plasma pistol advantages are slightly higher damage output than that of the bolt pistol. It relies on an overheating mechanic. If kept under control, it allows for more shots to be fired before needing to stop. At closer range, the plasma pistol is better for spamming shots. This can also be done with only one bullet remaining, but in my opinion should not be used unless you're down to your final round. It's very underwhelming, and the damage isn't worth the potential 10 single shots. Even with one round remaining, it's very niche and situational. Adding to this, the main disadvantage to the plasma pistol is a sheer lack of ammo. You will be getting very familiar with ammo resupplies if you run the sidearm. Overall, I'd recommend the bolt pistol over the plasma. It is overall more reliable. Reloading is our only real disadvantage, but we won't be using this weapon outside of shooting assaults out of the sky or sometimes overheating our weapons. As I said to begin with, the heavy is effectively the worst melee class in the game. With slow attacks and average damage, it's almost always a better option for us to use our guns instead. We do have some combos, but they're all impractical for most PvP scenarios. Ultimately, there is no great secret to using melee effectively. Avoid it at all costs and only engage in it when securing kills. If it's a team fight and you're being approached, consider repositioning over engaging. If you're in a smaller situation or involved in a 1v1, I would personally opt for almost any other options over meleeing. We will cover many options towards dealing with enemies at melee range, but none of them are covered here as our own melee is not practical and is our least used mechanic. As a side note, we can dash and melee attack for a bit of a lunging ability. It's situational, but definitely has its uses. As for all 4 grenades, there's nothing that stands out too much for the heavy. Starting with the frag grenade, this grenade is great for flushing out enemies in cover, can kill due to its relatively high damage output in the immediate blast area, it can be bounced off surfaces and is somewhat easily avoidable, but it is a solid pick for any class. As for the crack grenade, it sticks to any enemy it touches, deals underwhelming damage but does cause a brief stagger. This is a great counter for the Bulwark, and it's the best counter for the heavy when it's partnered up with the heavy plasma incinerator, as we have ourselves the most effective counter to the Bulwark class entirely. Simply stick the Bulwark and begin charging up a shot. When the grenade explodes, release and smile. This is something we'll go over a little bit more when we cover the matchups, but put simply, it's the only counter the heavy has for the Bulwark. The Melta bomb has somewhat more use with the heavy than most other classes, due to the nature of the bomb being that it's best used by baiting enemies towards it. As the heavy is unfortunately an appetizing melee target for most enemies, using this whilst retreating can and should help. It's not a complete 180 counter, but it can turn the odds better than most options. Lastly, we have the shot grenade. As you probably already know, this is technically the strongest grenade within Eternal War. It explodes on impact, making tactical placements possible. It offers a flashbang to anyone unfortunate enough to be facing it when it explodes, and it causes a decent damage over time and slow debuff area of effect. It's a great grenade for any class and in any scenario, and my personal favourite. If there are no Bulwarks on the enemy team, then I will use the shot grenade over the crack. Otherwise, I will always carry crack grenades if there are enemy Bulwarks. Iron Halo is definitely one of the strongest abilities in the game. It offers incredible counter potential in team fights, but 1v1s especially. Typically, as a general rule, we should never be engaging with Iron Halo unless we are deliberately using it to block shots for allies. Oftentimes, we can assist in fights by simply posting up next to allies and activating our Halo. Of course, our most practical use for this ability is mid-gunfight. Using this halfway through an enemy's magazine should be relatively easy, given we have 4 armor slots to withstand their initial first few rounds. Doing so should secure the win in most 1v1s. Of course, when it comes to other heavies, it mostly comes down to who fires first. When comparing a plasma launcher heavy versus a heavy bolter, the heavy bolter typically wins due to being able to drop the enemy's Iron Halo faster. The Iron Halo is not a bubble shield. It is in fact half of a bubble shield that will only shield us from the front. When dodging with Iron Halo active, it will redirect itself in whichever direction we are facing, making retreating a thing that needs to be considered before committing. As far as I can tell, frag grenades will bounce off the Iron Halo, crack grenades still stick, and shot grenades will explode on impact and can make for a fantastic counter for this class especially, considering we do often make ourselves a stationary target. Iron Halo is also obviously open to flanks from the sides and behind. We can quickly become overwhelmed when this is the case. There isn't much of a counter for it, mostly having good positioning and team presence is the answer to Iron Halo's weak points. I feel I should add that Iron Halo will only negate range damage and does not affect melee, highlighting my point on keeping enemies at range. I should also add that Iron Halo can quickly be shot down by 2 or more attacking enemies, so be aware of this when fighting multiple opponents. The Iron Halo's cooldown is dynamic, meaning we can deactivate whenever we want to save however much of our charge is left and make our following cooldown shorter. Iron Halo is great for making short burst pushes into enemy positions. As I mentioned before, we can assist teammates, put pressure onto enemy positions, and otherwise create a problem for the enemy team. Be aware that this comes with the caveat of making ourselves a prime target, and our invulnerable status will not last forever. Consider using it in this fashion wisely, as it can easily lead to poor positioning or having zero counter potential. As a last note, I've used Iron Halo to some effectiveness in retreating from firefights. We may have superior firepower, but if 2 or more enemies are advancing and 1 is looking to engage in melee, then we are almost always better off repositioning with the team than standing firm. It may be a fight we could possibly win, but it's much better for us to hedge our bets on different circumstances if we can. Always be prepared for enemies trying to bait your Iron Halo. This is a great counter for us. If enemies force the Iron Halo and then immediately retreat, consider repositioning, as they can and will likely be preparing to counter. Overall, the Iron Halo is very solid and has some very good uses beyond just countering in 1v1s. The matchup section will be a little bit different this time, folks. This is due to the fact that I don't think the Heavy has any advantage matchups whatsoever. We definitely have advantages in certain matchups, but nothing outright setting us apart from other classes. I will explain as we go. For our neutral matchups, we have the Tactical, Sniper, and Heavy. Starting with the Tactical, we both have very good range damage and do not excel in melee combat. That said, the Tactical can and may want to get in and finish us off with melee due to them being better at it than ourselves. Whilst we have the Iron Halo to counter in a straight 1v1, the Tactical has 2 grenade slots to potentially either bring the Halo down very quickly or shock our location, thus blinding us and or forcing us to reposition. Whilst we do have 4 armor slots, the Tactical has an Auspex scan which will increase all damage we take from enemies. As you can see, we have nothing that the Tactical can't counter and vice versa. There's not much to say to these matchups other than the Tactical is a less fortified but faster version of ourselves, and we should aim to be firing on them before they fire on us. For sniper matchups, again, we both have very good range damage, more so in our case as the sniper relies more heavily on accuracy for the better damage. The sniper does lack a power melee weapon, but they may still want to get close when running the carbine SMG. Be aware of this. Whilst we do have the Iron Halo to negate their shots, and it does take some time for them to bring it down due to their typically slow fire rate, we are a prominent target for headshots due to our stature in fights. We are not the sniper's preferable target due to high armor and the Iron Halo, but we don't possess anything to target them specifically either. As I said with the Tactical, there isn't much more to say outside of don't let them bait your Halo. A good sniper will look to bait it out and then bring you down once you don't have it. For heavy on heavy mirror matches, there is a huge focus on primary weapons. If you're using the heavy bolter, you will have an easier time here, as it brings down the Halo faster and can rip a Halo and heavy's armor and health in one straight wind-up. Outside of this, if you're both running the same weapons, then it will mostly come down to who shot first and who initiates the Iron Halo first. Timing your Halo for after the enemy heavies is a great strat, as it usually results in theirs falling first whilst yours is still up. This creates a moment of great pressure on the enemy heavy. Other than this, it is a case of it comes down to individual skill. For disadvantage matchups, we have a whopping 3, the Vanguard, the Assault, and the Bulwark. Beginning with the Vanguard, possibly the weakest of the 3 advantage matchups, but still in a position to outmatch a heavy usually. Due to the Vanguard being capable at all ranges, we can find ourselves in long or close range gunfights. Obviously, a Vanguard's one natural counter for us is the grapnel launcher that can allow for them to get close to us and completely negate our Iron Halo with their melee attacks. The one saving grace is the Vanguard doesn't have access to a power weapon, meaning they don't excel in melee all that much. Regardless, we want to aim at keeping them at range and not letting them get too close. Our best option for a Vanguard who has grapnel launched us is to continue emptying our gun into them and hope for the best. A little harder to do with the plasma launcher, but outside of this option, we would also be reliant on team support. Other than this one factor, the Vanguard doesn't have any other advantages on us. We make for a challenging enemy to gun down at range due to high armor and the Iron Halo, and this is preferably where we want all Vanguards, as they only have 2 armor slots to our 4. As for the Assault class, they are somewhat of a direct counter for us. Whilst they lack the same range damage as ourselves, they will ultimately be looking to surprise us from behind and kill us before we even have chance to shoot. An airborne assault is usually an easy target for our heavy bolter. However, if we are running the heavy plasma, then we should be switching to our sidearm every time. Try and remember this, as it can be key to keeping the assault off you. Obviously, our Iron Halo is useless against them, and once again, our only solid option outside of team support is to empty our gun into any advancing assaults and hope for the best. The Assault has power weapon options, meaning they can kill us in as little as 1 or 2 hits. In a straight 1v1 firefight, we should be winning, but a good Assault will not want to ever let themselves be in that situation. Ultimately, it's down to us to be aware, constantly checking for flanks and doing our best to keep them at range and not giving them the advantage. The Assault also has a similar dependence on solid teamwork in order to thrive. The main difference to the Heavy is the Heavy relies on the team to stay alive, whereas the Assault relies on the team to secure flanks. Finally, we have the Bulwark. If you've played either the Bulwark or Heavy, then you may be very aware of the disparity between these two classes. The Bulwark is primed to deal with Heavies, and a half-decent Bulwark can make our life hell. They can negate our primary weapons entirely with their shield, they have their banner for when we catch them off guard, and they have access to power melee weapons, meaning they can kill us with very few melee attacks. An approaching Bulwark is always an issue. Unless we are using the Heavy Plasma Incinerator and carrying a crack grenade, then we are better off retreating. The 1-2 combo for countering Bulwarks is to stick them with the crack grenade and immediately begin charging your shot, then release once the grenade has detonated. Miss either of these and your survival chances just plummeted, but land both and the Bulwark is dead no matter what. We can run Melta bombs and try to deal with them this way, as one thing we can guarantee is they will want to get close to us, but otherwise we need to be in and around our team to avoid letting them latch on. I found some success countering Bulwarks with the Heavy Plasma Incinerator due to being able to charge up shots and fire them at the environment around the Bulwark shield. I found this was a great deterrent mostly. Sometimes I could secure kills, but honestly, I was just glad to have something to fend them off with. This is the most advantageous or disadvantageous matchup within Eternal War. Heavies must run back to their team if caught alone by a Bulwark, and Bulwark should be looking to zone them out and target them whenever possible. As always, keep an eye on what classes the enemy team are playing. I feel like this is especially important for the Heavy. A distinct lack of Bulwarks and Assaults is obviously quite a good thing. Overall, the Heavy is a strong class when played to its strengths. It suffers mostly from having the longest list of disadvantages out of all the classes, and it suffers even more due to being the most team reliant. There are many factors outside of its control which can and will give it a hard time in games. However, with that said, when supported by a solid team and able to consistently keep enemies at range, this class can certainly do well and even thrive at times. A solid Heavy will aim to suppress and keep enemies locked down to their positions with their superior firepower. They will know how and when to reposition, and they will ultimately try to stick with their team as much as possible. Outside of following these guidelines, you will likely find yourself having a harder time with this class than most others. I personally think the Heavy is due some love and is in need of some kind of melee defense. I wouldn't normally speculate like this, but if the Iron Halo allowed for some damage over time, similar to the shot grenade, and or a stagger effect for when melee attackers come into collision with it, the Heavy would be in a better place to deal with any melee attackers, and the disadvantages against Bulwarks wouldn't be so overwhelming. I think the Heavy can very much do well in Eternal War, but it completely lacks the independence that most of the classes have. Thanks for watching, folks. I appreciate all the interaction I've received over the past few weeks, and I've had a great time creating these videos. As I said before, the tactical class will be next, followed finally by the Assault, and I should have some other videos in between. For anyone interested in the weekly play series, then you'll find more info in the video's description below. I have some ideas I'm working on already, but it would be great to get an idea of what people want, so hit me up in the comments. Thanks again for watching, folks, as always, and until next time, peace.